and welcome everyone to our very first session of Tea Time Talks with MDRP. I'm Anushree Srivastava, the creator of Medical Devices Regulatory Professionals, an exclusive LinkedIn group for all your devices regulatory concerns. I'm a biomedical engineer and I have worked as a scientist mainly in cancer detection and therapy. I'm now in the medical devices regulatory sector and use my scientific knowledge to bring and sustain medical devices in global markets. Our topic today is device classification, back to the basics. We will be talking about how medical devices are classified across the globe and how these classes are relevant from the regulatory perspective. I also have with me today two guest speakers. Our first speaker is Busisiwe, who is joining us from Johannesburg, South Africa. Hello, Busisiwe. Welcome to the discussion. Let's hear a little bit about your experience in the medical devices space.
Thank you, Anushree, and hello to our listeners. I'm Busisiwe Mdluli, CEO and Lead Regulatory Affairs Consultant for Makono Consulting. For the past 7 years working in the medtech industry, I have dedicated my career to actively champion the continued introduction of safe and effective medical devices and IVED within the SADC and SSA regions. I hope you enjoy and find this session insightful. Thank you.
Thank you, Busisiwe. We are happy to have you here. Our second guest today is Varun, who is joining us from Bangalore, India. Hi, Varun. Our listeners would like to hear more about your regulatory background.
Thank you, Anushree, and hello to all the listeners. I'm Varun Trivedi, and I'm currently heading the Quality and Regulatory at Healthcube India Private Limited, a medical device startup based in Bangalore. With over 10 years of experience in the healthcare sector, I have worked with multiple early and mid-stage startups in setting up their QMS processes and getting regulatory clearances. I have experience working with India, EU, US, and few other countries, and I hope to share my learnings today with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Varun, and good to have you with us today. Okay, listeners, today we'll talk about device classification, which is the starting step towards bringing a medical device into the global market. We'll discuss the specific characteristics of devices that determine their classification and how, despite the different classification systems followed in different countries, the crux of the classification methodology remains the same. Regulatory bodies across the globe provide rules for classifying medical devices in order to clear them for sales in specific regions. In the early 90s, experts in the field started wondering if there should be a way to align these rules and requirements globally. This led to the formation of the Global Harmonization Task Force, which was founded by representatives from 5 reference markets: the United States, the European Union, Canada, Australia, and Japan. The standardized rules explain that classification is mainly based on factors such as the duration of device contact with the body, the degree of invasiveness, whether the device delivers medicinal products or energy to the body, whether they are intended to have a biological effect on the patient, and whether they have a local effect or a systemic effect. Devices that use energy sources for functioning, like you would know, we come across devices that need electricity for operation. Such devices are called active devices. Their non-energy requiring counterparts are passive devices. When we talk about duration of contact, devices may be transient in use, which means that they are used for less than 60 minutes of the patient, like you could say examination gloves. Or they could be short-term use, that is intended for anywhere between 60 minutes to 30 days, like urinary catheters on patients who've had surgeries. And finally, we have long-term use devices that go on for more than 30 days, like implants. Device classes generally increase with increased risk. So if you have a system of 4 classes, class 1, 2, 3, and 4, you will see that class 1 are the least risky devices, like bandages, thermometers, whereas class 4 are the riskiest, such as pacemakers and heart valves. It must also be remembered that while the rationale for classification remains the same, the actual classes may differ. If you are a device manufacturer with a class 2 device in United States of America and you want to get it certified for sale in Canada, there is a likelihood that your device may need to be reclassified under the rules of Health Canada. All countries have a set of rules which become fairly straightforward to follow once you gain an understanding of the risk and duration effects. For experts, what are your thoughts on the standardization of device classification? Do you see the absence of a common rule book as a roadblock in understanding regulatory compliance in different geographies? Let's start with you, Busisiwe.
In my opinion, standardization can help maximize compatibility, interoperability, safety, and quality. It can also facilitate commoditization of formally custom processes, create a situation in which all countries and regions can realize mutual gains. Also, standardized classification of medical devices will serve as a common language for registering and marketing medical devices across the whole health system at all levels. To answer your second question, my answer is yes. I do think it's a roadblock in understanding regulatory compliance in different countries. People cannot comply with regulations if they do not understand what is it that is required. In regulatory design and development, policymakers often feel the pressure to issue new rules or even expand existing ones to cover unforeseen circumstances or close loopholes and to address new problems. The cumulative effect of reacting to such pressure can, in my opinion, lead cumulatively to a loss of simplicity and therefore the loss of the ability in the target groups to understand what compliance with the resulting regulatory structure involves. The complexity of rules as it is and the overall regulatory structure generally raise the cost of compliance. So, one classification system could possibly save us a lot of time and money. Thank you.
That does make a lot of sense, Busisiwe, and I think I do tend to agree with you on a lot of the points that you made. So Varun, what are your thoughts on this? We also know that a similar rationale is followed for IVD products. Would you like to talk a little bit about IVD's classification and how they relate to individual and public health risk?
Thank you, Anushree, for that question. See, basically, for any medical device, the basis of classification remains the same, right? We are looking at two things. One is the risk pertaining to the product and the intended use, which is nothing but the claim that the manufacturer makes for the product, right? Based on these two inputs, the device classification remains the same. That said, for IVDs, as they deal with human specimen, the way they are classified in certain regions may vary. For example, in EU, the rules to classify IVDs are different compared to how you classify general medical devices. Now you have ABCD as against 1, 2A, 2B, and 3. For classifying IVDs. One point I would like to highlight, which is specifically applicable to IVDs, is based on whether the device is for home use or not. The device classification may vary. For example, a glucose monitoring system, which is claimed to be used in home versus for a professional use, might have a different classification, and the route for conformity may also vary. Anushree?
That's great, Varun. To summarize, I think we can agree that device classification is a fairly straightforward concept, but one that requires a good understanding of the devices at hand. Coming back to you, Busisiwe, when we talk about regulatory requirements, we generally restrict ourselves to the reference markets like USA, Canada, Australia, EU, and Japan. As far as classification of device goes, how is it different or similar in the South African market? The SAHPRA, which is the regulatory authority in South Africa, recognizes 4 classes of medical devices and IVDs. Could you throw some more light on this?
Thank you, Anushree. Medical device regulations in Africa as a whole are designed along the framework of models used in developed countries. For example, the requirements for importation and exportation of medical devices in South Africa, Algeria, Kenya, and Ethiopia are similar to the internationally recognized certification programs of the European CE mark, the US FDA, and the Australian Hybrid Therapeutic Goods Administration. Now, this is important in a sense that it aligns African countries with a harmonized framework for medical device regulations. However, there may be medical devices or IVs where the classification in South Africa, to be specific, is different to the classification in other countries. The applicant should always take into account the South African requirements when determining the risk classification of a device that is to be supplied in South Africa. The regulations of medical devices and IVs is based on a 4-tier, 16-rule-based classification system for obtaining device licenses for manufacturers, importers, and distributors. The risk classification is from A to Class D, with A being that does not pose any danger or harm to the public, and with D imposing the highest risk. Now, the manufacturer should decide if the product is a medical device or IVD based on the definition, determine the intended use of the medical device or IVD. Also, consider all rules in order to establish the proper classification of the device. And there are a few factors influencing device classification. I'm not going to mention all of them right now. I'll just say a few that are common, which are the duration of contact of the device with the body, the degree and site of invasiveness into the body, whether the device delivers medicines or energy to the patient, and lastly, combination of the devices. In some cases, classification is or can be inconclusive, and more than one rule can apply. If this happens, the higher classification always applies. If a medical device is intended to be used in more than one part of the patient's body, the medical device is then classified on the assumption that it will be used on the part of the body that poses the highest risk. For invasive devices, for an example, this may be the central circulatory or the central nervous system. For group systems or procedure packs, the classification for the entire group system or pack is the highest classification of any individual device in the group. For example, if the pack includes 3 devices that could be classified under Class B, C, and Class D, then the entire pack is classified as Class D. Another important fact is that the presence of a registered medicine in a procedure pack does not affect the classification. Lastly, this does not cover everything, obviously. However, there is more to this topic, like how to apply the rules of the medical device and IVD classification. Because of time, we'll just leave it here, and I'm available to answer any questions should our listeners have any after this session. Thank you, and back to you, Anushree.
Thank you, Mrs. Iwe. That was a very interesting summary of what exactly happens in the South African market for device classification. All right, so most of our listeners realize that for a lot of devices, understanding the classification could be pretty straightforward thanks to the rules provided by the regulatory bodies. But there are still some device types that require some more understanding. I'm thinking about software as medical devices. I have questions from our listeners about whether we have a definitive approach for these kinds of devices. When it comes to software, risk determination can be slightly challenging. Speaking specifically of the upcoming EU MDR requirements, Rule 11 of the MDR talks about how software that provide information used by clinicians to arrive at decisions related to diagnosis or therapy should be class 2A, except, and this is where it gets tricky, if the decisions may cause death or irreversible deterioration of health, in which case the software will be class 3, or serious deterioration of health, serious, not irreversible, in which case it is class 2B. Adding to that, software that monitors physiological processes is classified as class 2A, except if it is used for monitoring vital physiological parameters, whose variations could result in immediate danger to the patient, in which case it is classified as 2B. So the tricky part is that there will be hardly any standalone software getting classified as class 1 because most software will provide some diagnostic or therapeutic information, after all, that is bound to affect decision making. Varun, if you would like to talk about this rule in MDR and how it may affect the digital healthcare scene for manufacturers, as even in India, we're seeing an influx of startups that are into digital healthcare and have these software that require clearance.
I agree with you, Anushri, that the software classification can at times get tricky, and then the fact that, more and more software, the dependency on software is getting higher and higher, even with the introduction of AI in the healthcare scheme of things, the overall classification of software can be, little challenging or confusing at times, right? But remember one thing, right? Whenever we talk about classification, I would always go back and point towards the two key inputs for any medical device classification that we need to look into, right? One is the risk that the product has, and second is the intended use that the manufacturer has defined, right? The manufacturer at any point in time is the best expert to estimate the level of risk the software can possess, right? Based on which the classification can be made. In case of MDR, where the rules have been defined, can be a very simple reference for the manufacturer to understand what the classification can be. In case of FDA, FDA has a guidance on how the manufacturer can classify risk associated with software. And that can also be a good reference for the manufacturers to understand what their software classification would be, right? To give you an example of what could be a class 1 software, take an example where a software which is used to only take an image, store or transfer the image to the doctor for the doctor to do further analysis. Maybe that's the kind of software that you're looking for, a class 1, class 1 classification kind of thing, right? That can be one such example. Your thoughts?
Right. Thank you, Varun. That's a very interesting perspective. But you spoke about a software that could be used to store or transfer image for the doctor to analyze. Isn't ultimately some sort of diagnosis happening there? And like, if I understand, if the software is diagnosing or used for diagnosis, then it comes under Rule 11 and it might not be class 1.
Good point. As I mentioned, right, I'm not claiming diagnosis to be something that my software is doing, right? And with what you mentioned, I would again point towards what I was claiming, right? Intended use of the device. So it plays a very important role for eventually, concluding to what the classification of the software would be, right? And that's something, the manufacturers have to be very clear on as to what they want to claim as part of their medical device. Even software as a standalone medical device eventually will be tied down to the claim that the manufacturer is going to make.
Right, absolutely. Once again, very interesting perspective. How about you, Buzisiwe? Do you see a lot of such devices on the South African market? And how's the market in terms of medical devices manufacturing as compared to marketing clearance of foreign devices?
We do, Anushri. South Africa does not limit in terms of which devices can be placed on the market. We have all types of medical devices. Now, regulatory approval for medical devices is in its infancy. And at this stage, only a license is required, and regulatory approval similar to that required of medicines is not required, other than where the device is an electromagnetic device or a radiation emitting device, in which case the device must be registered with the Department of Health and bear the CE mark. Coming to software, software is regulated under the Copyright Act 98 of 1978. This act merely protects the intellectual property associated with the software, rather than the application of such software in the medical field. At this stage in South Africa, there is no separate legislation to deal with the application of software in the device field. Software is regulated in different ways, depending on the manufacturer's intended purpose for the software and how it is supplied. The regulatory requirements apply to all forms of medical device software, including software that is embedded, for example, firmware in hardware, such as field programmable gate arrays, electronic programmable read-only memory, flash memory, statistic or dynamic random access memory, and so on. Software often forms an integral part of an electronic device. For example, in a pacemaker or patient monitor. In these cases, the software is a part of the device and it is not considered to be a separate or distinct device. Software that fits the definition of a medical device in its own right requires separate entry on the South African Medical Device Register, which means that the prospective holder of the registration certificate must lodge an application with the council to include the device in the medical device register. Some devices have more than one type of software residing within them. For example, an infusion pump monitor system may have software to control the infusion parameters, which will be classified under Class C, and then for the logging of patient data, which will be classified under Class A. If the device is supplied as a complete unit, the classification of the complete device is the highest classification, which in this case will be Class C. If the software is supplied separately, then the individual classification of each device applies. And then on responding to the question of how the digital healthcare scene in South African market is, South Africa has fully embraced the potential of digital health technology to improve the quality and coverage of healthcare, increase access to services and skills, and also promote positive changes in health behaviors to prevent the onset of acute and chronic diseases. South Africa is seeing the growth of digital health accelerators such as the DHCP aimed at supporting digital health innovations in the country. On the other hand, the government is also fast-tracking the implementation of National Health Insurance Scheme, which will eventually cover all South Africans. In addition, we have medical manufacturing capabilities and knowledge, and a highly competitive, innovative scene distinguishing us from other African economies. For example, we have the largest life sciences market on the African continent at approximately $3.2 billion US. This cultivates into what the continent's largest healthcare market is valued at approximately $28.1 billion US. We are not 100% there yet because of lack of resources and other contributing factors. In many cases, in fact, it does not even go down to financial resources, but necessary infrastructure. For example, you could have the state-of-the-art MRI machine, but if you cannot turn on the lights due to lack of electricity, you can only use the MRI as decoration. However, an increasing demand of accountable care and the digital delivery of healthcare is driving more startups to develop innovative healthcare solutions. Thank you, Anushri.
Wow, thank you, Busisiwe. I think there were a lot of things that I learned from the summary that you just gave. All right, let's shed light on some of the important aspects of device classification and how things function in these two geographies that are high growth markets for medical devices. In India, however, I hope we get to see a more exclusive treatment for medical devices in the regulatory space and dive deeper into the many variations that we see in device technology and overall action mechanisms. Currently, India has a list of notified devices that are regulated in a manner similar to that for drugs. Varun, do you see this changing as more companies start to shift their focus to devices and realize that India, being a high growth market, could tap this potential and start having a dedicated regulatory wing for medical devices as well?
Absolutely, Anushri. Things have changed drastically in India in the past few years. A few years ago, India was regulating, approximately 8 to 10 devices. Today, we have a list of few hundred devices which have been, notified, or you can say are being regulated by the Central Drugs Standard Control Organization (CDSCO). With MDR 2017, that has been updated for medical device regulation, and an online portal that has come up. Through which you can submit your application, you can track your application. There has been a lot of transparency that CDSCO has got into the whole system, right? In fact, they're actively working on developing a strong system to regulate devices and ensure that we have the right devices in the market, unlike what we have been seeing in the past few years, right? So yes, definitely, you see a lot of growth, you see a lot of potential, you see a lot of positive movement towards what CDSCO has been doing. And over the next few years, you see a much more stronger regulatory system, which will be running the markets in India and ensuring that we have safe medical devices in the market.
That's great. Here's to hoping that we get to see a more rigid regulatory control for medical devices in India as well. Well, that's all that we have for today. Thank you very much, Bhutisive and Varun, for kickstarting these sessions and how. I had a lot of fun chatting with the both of you, and I hope you enjoyed it too. To all our listeners, we are also going to have dedicated discussions on Indian and South African regulation in our future session. So stay tuned for more information coming your way. This is Anushri at the Medical Devices Regulatory Professionals signing off on our very first session of Tea Time Talks with MDRP.